Hello, I'm Ronald, Associate Vice President of the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy, and welcome to Both Sides of the Bars, a discussion-driven show that examines the criminal justice system from various perspectives, including from those most impacted by the criminal justice system. We discuss critical questions about how the current system works, its intersections with social justice, and highlight the efforts that are being made to improve the lives of everyone that is affected by it. We ask you, the viewer, to share your comments with us on both sides of the bars at Twitter at the Fortune Society. So today we have some fantastic guests with us, and the issue is injustice in the immigration system. And so I'm going to start with Khalil Cumberbatch. Thank you, Khalil, for being on the show today.
Thank you.
So Khalil is Manager of Training and Communications at JustLeaderShip USA. So, in just a little bit about your background, Khalil is the Manager of Training and Communications at JustLeaderShip, a national nonprofit dedicated to cutting the U.S. correctional population in half by 2030. An ambitious goal indeed. Khalil graduated from CUNY Lehman College Masters in Social Work program in 2004, where he was awarded the Urban Justice Award for his work with underserved and marginalized communities that are negatively impacted by mass incarceration, as well as high poverty and unemployment rates, lack of access to quality education, and other ineffective social safety nets. In December 2014, Khalil was one of the 2 recipients to receive an executive pardon from New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo to prevent his deportation from the United States. So congratulations, and thank you for being with us on both sides of the bars.
Thank you for having me.
And with us as well, we have Wang, who's an attorney at the Immigrant Defense Project, which is a nonprofit dedicated to fighting for the rights of immigrants. It was founded more than 20 years ago. The IDP is nationally known for its work defending immigrants who have had contact with the criminal justice system. In 2015, Lee was awarded a Skadden Fellowship to address the devastating effect that mass detention and deportation has on families. So it's great to have both of you with us on both sides of the bars for this really important and timely conversation about immigration. Would you agree that this is timely, considering the political climate?
Undoubtedly.
So, so why don't we start with a question, right? And some of the topics that we would like to cover. So to either one of you, but why don't we start with you, Khalil? The U.S. has a deep-rooted and closely intertwined history of accepting people that immigrate to the United States from other countries, right? How do we get to the point where we are criminalizing and deporting millions of individuals who are now here on our shores?
So it's a really great question, and some of it is could be answered historically, and some of it could be answered in terms of the way that we have criminalized segments of the immigrant community. So if we look historically, we see that that there have been periods in history where particular segments of the immigrant communities have been marginalized and criminalized. So during the era when they were building a railroad, we saw that it was predominantly Asian immigrants who were criminalized and marginalized. And then at some point we saw that it was heavily focused on people who were immigrating from Mexico. And now we're at the point where people who are immigrants who come here, documented and undocumented, are criminalized because of some involvement with the criminal justice system. So how we got here has some history in the way that we have treated certain segments of the immigrant population. But more specifically, how we got here is through a lot of flawed policies, a lot of fear-mongering, and a lot of targeting people who have been victims of over-policing and over-criminalization.
That's a great answer. And so, Lee, to add on to that, how would you describe what we're seeing now in terms of immigration policies? I mean, and a lot of it, I mean, there's this conversation about there's a tremendous amount of fear right now with respect to deportation because of the politics, right? And people are afraid to take their children to school. Some people are afraid to go to work. We're hearing about these raids and so forth. So can you, for our audience who's not really that informed about immigration policy and what is actually going on the ground, can you like enlighten the audience, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, for the past several months, we've seen a really, really kind of ugly storm that has brewed around immigration, you know, with political candidates increasingly using awful and hateful rhetoric.
Yes.
But I think, you know, what gets obscured in some of the coverage of the presidential campaign is that President Obama, unfortunately, has implemented some really awful policies.
Yes.
And what you referred to with people being afraid to actually leave their homes or take their children to school, that has really happened over the last month, where the Obama administration announced that they were going to use very aggressive tactics and actually go to people's homes and raid their homes to try to identify specifically Central American families, which are mostly women and children who have sought refuge in this country. But you know, as Khalil knows, that tactic has actually been used for several years now, specifically targeting immigrants who've had some contact with the criminal justice system. And so, you know, while I think a lot of people are concerned about what's coming in 2016, the truth is that right now we're already in an unprecedented era of mass deportation where, you know, as you said, we've seen more than 2 million people get deported by Obama. And it doesn't need to be this way. It hasn't been this way historically. And, you know, we're here really in large part because of, you know, this long history that Khalil has mentioned, and also because of a set of laws that was passed about 20 years ago in 1996 that have vastly increased the ability to deport people because of criminal convictions.
Okay. And so generally when we hear about immigration, we think about like border states, right? And we're not a border state with the exception of Canada, right? And we don't have a lot of people coming in from Canada. So how concerning is it for people who live in New York, who live in Jersey, and who live in other states that are not necessarily like Texas and Arizona, California, and so forth?
So I guess first it's really important to make a distinction between what is officially classified as a border state. You know, most people, when they hear the term border state, they do think of states like Texas and Arizona and California. But the federal government identifies a border as anything of 100 miles of any entry point in the country. So technically, New York State is considered a border state. So that's the first connection that people need to understand, is that heightened level of security and focus on immigrants with criminal records falls right underneath this idea that we need to have heightened security in border states. So yeah, I don't know if Lee wants to add anything to that.
But thanks for providing that clarification, because I'm sure that was something that people probably did not know necessarily.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and a lot of people don't realize that, you know, New York is along the border. It's, you know, I think in terms of the recent announcement by Obama that he was going to target Central American families, people who are seeking asylum in the United States, that program, as far as we know, is not happening right now in New York City. But, I mean, that being said, the administration has an ongoing program of using home raids, community arrests, going to courthouses, picking people up, you know, as they go in for their appearances, going to homeless shelters, going to supportive housing. And they have a list of very clear priorities of people that they're targeting. And, you know, at the top of that list are people with prior criminal convictions. So I think people do have reason to be concerned.
Got it. And so now that we have an understanding about the broader policies that currently exist, how does it actually work on the ground? So my understanding is that oftentimes fingerprints are sent to immigration, so that is how they are aware that someone is possibly undocumented or have. So can you like walk us through the process? So I'm gonna start with you, Lee, and then Khalil, you have a personal story, considering that you received a pardon. So if you will, I'd like for you to share that as well. Sure. So Lee, the fingerprint, how does it happen so that someone can get an understanding about how the whole process works?
Yeah, I mean, since the Bush administration, we've seen this increasing entangling of the criminal justice and the immigration systems. Yeah. And in New York, actually, the criminal justice system is the primary pipeline to deportation. Yeah. So that's something that's important for people to know. And the entanglement is quite literal. I mean, as you say, when someone gets, what happens is when you get booked and you get fingerprinted, those fingerprints are automatically sent to a national criminal database that is then fed to immigration authorities. Yeah. And so if immigration authorities believe that you are someone who may be deportable, that database basically sends up a little red flag to them. And in many jurisdictions, although fortunately not in New York City right now, once that notification is sent over to immigration authorities, they can then put in a request to the local jail and say, can you please let us know when this person is going to be released? We'll show up, and then that person just gets handed over automatically to immigration authorities, and then they could go to immigration detention. Now, luckily in New York City, our city council has passed some protective legislation, so there are some limits to the information that our local jails will share with immigration authorities, but that fingerprinting is an automated system. This has been fought out, politically for many years now, and so it's really automatic at this point.
Exactly. So there's so much control that the city or state has over that process. But again, thank you for providing that information and clarification for people who might not necessarily have had it.
Sure.
So Khalil, again, you have direct experience with this, and I know that it was pretty traumatic for you and for your family and for people that know and love you and care for you. So why don't you tell us about this experience so that, again, our viewers can see how someone like yourself, who's pretty established in the community, is doing well, is working for an organization, how you can have the rug snatched out from under you and have your whole life disrupted.
Yeah. So first, I think it's important to state that my mother and I migrated here to the U.S. from our native Guyana in 1986. I came when I was 4 years old. And my mother and I came here as legal permanent residents, otherwise referred to as green card holders. And we lived in Queens, New York for the majority of my life. I went through the public school system, graduated high school, worked since I was 16. And at the age of 20, I committed a robbery and was ultimately sentenced to what would turn out to be an 8-year prison sentence. And I served 6.5 years of that prison sentence and was released early in 2010. And after I was released, I began to rebuild my life. I began my reentry process, and a part of that was employment, a part of that was going back to school, finishing up college, a part of that was beginning a family and becoming engaged in my community, and was doing that successfully for about 4.5 years. It was in May of 2014, May 8th specifically, that it was around 7 o'clock in the morning, and my wife and I get a knock on the door. And when we looked outside of the window, we saw that it was what appeared to be police officers. And and anyone who has a knock on the door at 7 o'clock in the morning and sees that it's police officers has some level of concern, specifically for someone who has went through the criminal justice system and fully and completely understands that although I had successfully completed parole, that a person is never really free of the criminal justice system, that although a person has lived a productive life and has totally turned their life around, that there's still this possibility that they can just come to your door and knock on the door and ring the doorbell at 7 o'clock in the morning. So my wife and I let them in because they were law enforcement, and we figured that it was nothing, it was probably just some questions that they had about something that had happened in the neighborhood possibly. So when we let them in, it was in our living room that they told us that they were there from the Department of Homeland Security, specifically Immigration Customs Enforcement, otherwise referred to as ICE, and that they were there to detain and arrest me because of my criminal conviction, which at that point was well over a decade ago. Despite the fact that I had lived in the community for 4+ years, despite the fact that I was not a risk in any shape, form, or fashion to national security or to my community, the fact that I had successfully completed parole, was 1 week away from completing a graduate degree, had started a family, I was still deemed to be mandatorily detained, mandatorily detainable, which meant that despite all of that immigration judge had no other course of action but to order me detained. And it began a 5-month odyssey, so to speak. It was a lot of advocacy and a lot of support that was rallied around not only myself but my wife and my 2 children. My wife herself became an advocate throughout that whole process, and ultimately we were able to persuade the government to exercise what is called prosecutorial discretion, which means that the government has the ability to say that we will not deport this person, that we will exercise prosecutorial discretion despite this person having this type of conviction, or despite this person being in this country for this amount of time. And the government did that, and I was released after 5 months of detention, and that was in October of 2014. And in December of 2014, I was one of 2 individuals that was granted a pardon by New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo. Both of us were granted pardons to relieve immigration consequences that came from criminal convictions. So with all of that, it's really important to keep in mind that my story is very much the exception, that we were able to garner an exceptional outcome, not only in the government exercising prosecutorial discretion, for someone who had what is called an aggravated felony, which basically means anyone convicted of that type of offense, which they don't have to be aggravated and they don't necessarily have to be felonies, is classified in the same category as someone who is a threat to national security or someone who has been convicted of an act of terrorism. And then on top of that, exercising, the government exercising prosecutorial discretion, we were able to win and secure a pardon from the New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo. But because it's the exception and because it's not the rule, there within lies some form of injustice. The fact that I had access to resources that many people in my position do not have access to is something that we need to change. It's something that we need to really make the rule and not the exception.
Got it. So the fact that you were on a particular path is what created the opportunity for you, the relationships that you established and so forth. So it's an anomaly, as you described, for you to have received the treatment that you received. And so, Lee, to you, what relief is available for individuals who find themselves entangled in the immigration justice system? Because as we know, apparently what happened to Khalil is not happening ordinarily.
Yeah, Khalil's case is really exceptional, and it's
Yes.
unfortunate. For certain types of immigrants, people who have, Khalil mentioned, these so-called aggravated felonies, which again, don't have to be aggravated and don't have to be felonies. They could actually be misdemeanors.
Yes.
There is very, very little relief. And because of laws that were passed 20 years ago, it basically robbed judges of any ability to consider, individual circumstances. So, the judge that Khalil appeared before couldn't consider all of the amazing work that he had done for the community, couldn't consider the fact that he was this tremendous leader in the reentry community, that he was an amazing father, who loved his children and supported his wife. None of that mattered. Essentially what happens is that Congress has imposed a mandatory minimum, except that mandatory minimum is permanent exile from your family. And so there's not a lot of relief. I think that there are ways, there's a lot of advocacy that the Immigrant Defense Project is working on, and I know that Fortune Society is helping us with, to try to change that. And I think that it's time for us to have that conversation.
Sure. What the issue when you talk about Homeland Security, you would think is public safety. You said you were not a risk to public safety, and we know that the majority of the individuals who are going through the system, they're not assessing whether or not there's a public safety risk. It's like, as you said, this is the mandatory minimum. You have to go through the system, and it's quite unfortunate that that's happening to them. So what do you both suggest with respect to policy change? I know that there are some policy proposals that you have that you all have been working on and trying to get support with. So why don't you start with that, Khalil?
Sure. So first, I think it's important to kind of say verbally that most people who are being targeted by home raids, most people who are swept up in the immigration system, have not committed any crime
At all.
That the only thing that the government uses to hold them and to detain them is the fact that they are here undocumented. And most people who are here undocumented live law-abiding lives, and they pay taxes, although they don't pay income taxes. Many of them own properties and they work. So I think that's important to say.
Yeah.
In terms of policies of what could be implemented and what really needs to be implemented to kind of right this injustice, is one of the things that Lee said is to give more discretion to immigration judges. The judge that I appeared in front of basically told me that despite everything that you have, you would be an ideal candidate for bond, but the reality is because of the conviction that you have, the sole conviction that you have, I have to order you mandatorily detainable. The other one is to end mass deportations in general, right? People should be, when we talk about public safety, we need to also think about what happens to families when a family member is snatched away from them, whether that's a father, a mother, a husband, a wife, and what that does to not only that family, but what it does to the fabric of the community that supports that family. The other one is to end mandatory detentions, right? I think that, mandatorily detaining someone without taking into any consideration what role they play in their family and their community poses more of a public safety risk than it does to protect families and communities. And then of course is to end home raids, right? I mean, I think that having someone come to your home and snatch a loved one, and in my case it was 7 o'clock in the morning, but in some cases it's in the middle of the night. Sometimes it's in front of children. It traumatizes family members. That it's not, again, lending to the overall goal of public safety. And last, I would say that, what Lee said, like permanent exile from someone's family and in many cases a country that they consider to be home is a punishment that is unjustifiable. I mean, even in my case, I served 6.5 years in prison. A judge gave me that as punishment. I served that time. And yet and still I was faced with this never-ending punishment just because of the fact that I was not a naturalized citizen.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective. Todd Clare, he's a researcher in New Jersey at Rutgers, and he talks about how communities are actually disrupted by incarceration, because when you sweep people up into the criminal justice system and into the immigration system without looking at how this impacts the family, you actually end up negatively impacting communities. So that seems to be consistent with what you're saying. Now, there's also something called the One Day to Protect New Yorkers campaign, which IDP is spearheading. Can you share something about that campaign with us?
Sure. So locally in New York State, we're pushing a campaign called One Day to Protect New Yorkers. And it's a bill that is going to be introduced to make a very small change that would have a huge impact. So essentially what we're asking for is for the state legislature to change the maximum allowable penalty for New York misdemeanors by just 1 day, so from 365 to 364. And the reason that matters is because unfortunately under immigration law, there are certain misdemeanors, if they are punishable by a year or more, they can get you deported. And that might seem crazy. You could have a first-time shoplifting offense and not serve a single day in jail, but because, on the books, it's punishable by a year or more, you can get deported. And so, this seems to us like a really common sense way to really protect thousands of New Yorkers. And I know the Fortune Society has joined on in support, and we're really hoping that it'll be acted on this during this legislative calendar.
And it wouldn't be something that New York will be the first to do, because other states have already done it.
Yeah.
And some states that are technically considered more conservative.
Nevada, Washington,
than
it's
New York.
interesting.
Yeah, so I just want to get that out there, because say, oh, well, New York will be the first one like enacting this law. No, we would not be the first. If you had an opportunity to talk to the mayor or the governor or the president about this immigration issue, what would you say? Khalil?
Well, first I would point out that that everyone involved in this conversation, from the people who are targeted by the system, from the people who purport it to be a system that works, that protects public safety, every one of those people that fall in between that gamut, that we all have a shared common goal, which is that we want to protect the fabric of family and community, and that these programs is clearly shown to not do that. That when you mandatorily detain and deport a family member, that it only serves to harm the family and the community. And then I would encourage governors and the president himself, if I had an opportunity to talk to them, to use a power that they already have, which is executive clemency in the form of pardons, which is one way to circumvent some of the unjust double punishment that people who are here as immigrants and also have criminal convictions. It is a way to circumvent that. So in my case, I was granted a pardon, which hugely relieves a lot of the consequences that come from my criminal conviction, particularly as it relates to immigration.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would urge them to use that power more.
Got it. I mean, clearly, the country benefits from you being here.
Thank
I
you.
mean, it would have been a disservice for you to have been sent, out of the country and to have been, for your family to be without you and for your community to be without you. So we're proud that we all could play a role in what ultimately happened to you.
Thank you.
And so, Lee, what about you? If you had an opportunity to say something to one of our high-level government officials, what would you say?
I would say that our immigration system is fundamentally unjust, and I think that at the core of it is this very, very un-American idea that it's okay somehow to impose a double punishment, that Khalil referred to on someone. When someone commits a crime, they do their time, they turn their life around, they should get a second chance. I think that is something that, the vast majority of Americans would get behind. And the idea that we would suddenly just, years later yank them from their families and permanently exile them is something that I think we all have to question as Americans.
Any closing thoughts, Khalil?
Just that, again, I think that when we have the conversation about immigration reform, all too often it is pigeonholed or it is sharply focused on people who are here undocumented. But the reality is that most people caught in the immigration system itself, whether they're in a detention center or facing immigration proceedings, are people who have some form of a criminal conviction, who are also here documented. So, and to move away from this rhetoric of undocumented versus documented immigrant.
All right. In 30 seconds, Lee, any closing comments?
I would encourage people to try to support the campaign to end home raids right now.
Okay.
I think it's just one symptom of a bigger problem, but if we all come together to stand up against home raids, I think that would be a really big step towards a more humane system.
Thank you. Again, thank you, Khalil, for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you. Lee,
Pleasure to be here.
keep doing the work that you both are doing. We really appreciate and value what you do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our guests, Khalil, Cumberbatch, and Lee Wang, for joining us on both sides of the bars today. And thank you in TV Land for joining us as well. If you're interested in finding out more about the Fortune Society, please check us out on the web at fortunesociety.org or on Facebook by typing in the Fortune Society. This is Ronald Day as we critically look at both sides of the bars.